Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETChat. I'm super pleased to have Mark Jones on today. Mark is the head of policy at the Born Free Foundation. Is also a veterinary surgeon, an original thinker. We go back quite a long way, and it's always good to talk to Mark because Mark, I think it's fair to say, maybe I'm going to insult you a bit, Mark, but I'm going to call you a contrarian. I think I'm a bit that way as well. I like to disrupt. My wife tells me if everybody's going in one direction, sometimes it's quite nice to go in the opposite direction, isn't it? So great to have you on the program today, Mark, and maybe give you a minute or two just for those people who don't know who you are, just to maybe give a bit of a backstory.
Sure. So thank you for inviting me on, Anthony. It's always a great pleasure to speak to you and to see you. So my name is Mark Jones. I trained as a vet at Liverpool University. I qualified in 1985, following which I spent about 3 years in small animal practice. Which it became apparent to me at a fairly early stage that veterinary practice, in the way that most people perceive it, probably wasn't going to be the path I was going to pursue long term. Much as though I have an enormous love for animals, and particularly wild animals. I subsequently went to Stirling University and did a master's in aquatic animal health and worked in association with the aquaculture and fisheries industries in Scotland for about 16 or 17 years, working on health and sustainability and latterly animal welfare related issues with that industry at a time when it was difficult to talk about animal welfare and fish in the same sentence. I think it's perhaps become a little bit easier to do so more recently. And I love the work. I've got to travel all over Scotland and wonderful places like Norway and Denmark and Canada. But I became increasingly concerned about some of the practices I was seeing. It's aquaculture, particularly, is an intensive form of animal agriculture, and particularly concerned for the way that the industry, or the way that animals that were involved in the industry were treated at times. So I left the industry in about 2003, and my wife and I travelled extensively and worked on a voluntary basis for quite some considerable time in wildlife rescue and rehabilitation centres, initially in Ecuador in South America, and then latterly in Thailand. Where we worked with all kinds of animals, bears, primates, lots of primates, birds, reptiles, and many others, many of which were victims in one way or another of wildlife trade, particularly for the pet trade, but also for other purposes as well. So many of the animals that came into the centre were victims of trade. And that got me interested in the wider issue of wildlife trade and trafficking and the impact that it has, not only on the welfare of the individual animals that get tied up in that trade, but also on the impacts that it has at a population level and at a conservation level for wildlife, and the wider impacts that has on biodiversity as a whole. So I came back. I did a further master's at the Institute of Zoology in London, and since then, for about the last 16 or 17 years, I've been working in the NGO animal protection world for various different organisations. But for the last 10 years, I've been with Born Free. And I think what I like and why I feel most at home at Born Free is because, as an organisation, while it does focus a lot on wildlife conservation, it always has a very, very strong consideration for the individual animal and the importance of protecting the well-being of individual animals and why that's important for wildlife conservation. So that's my story.
And obviously, really interesting campaign at the moment, Mark, around with Born Free around big cats and that whole area that they roam in. You know, a tiger will roam in, many hundreds of kilometers of territory, and then suddenly, we put them in a zoo and they're in a reasonably small enclosure. So I know Born Free works on the principle that we shouldn't have zoos. I think obviously Virginia McKenna, that whole Born Free film was very instrumental in me having the love of animals, wild and domesticated as you have. Probably one of the first films that really anthropomorphized animals to some degree, but also showed them as individuals. Elsa was a real life individual, wasn't she, in Kenya? But then other people like James Herriot, David Attenborough, obviously Gerald Durrell, who founded Jersey Zoo, were very important to me as well. So I remember going to Chester Zoo and seeing the polar bears pacing up, well, one polar bear pacing up and down, as a vet student, starting in Liverpool just as you left. Um, we could see that stereotypic behavior that we see in horses, stabled too long. There's certainly some species that we really shouldn't keep in zoos, and obviously polar bears, are one of those. And hopefully you can fill us in on that. But hopefully they're not being kept anymore. But I think big cats do start to come into that picture, particularly, I suppose, from an educational perspective. We now have these splendid programs David Attenborough and others make. We can learn so much just from watching those animals in the wild, which is probably much more realistic than watching them in a relatively small enclosure, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that Born Free these days does lots of work in different parts of the world. We have conservation programs in parts of Africa
Yeah.
and India. We have education, community outreach, and programs in the UK and also in parts of Africa. We do rescue and care work where we move some animals from very poor captive conditions to sanctuaries, and where we can, for rehabilitation and release into the wild, although in many cases that's not possible. And we run or collaborate with sanctuaries in Ethiopia and South Africa and in India and others. Um, and we do the policy work that I have some responsibility for. But the thing that prompted the creation of the charity in the first place, it wasn't actually Elsa the lioness, interestingly. It was an elephant, an African elephant, female African elephant, called
Yeah.
Poli Poli, who was one of the stars of the
Slowly.
of An Elephant Called Slowly, the film was,
Yeah.
which also starred Virginia McKenna and her husband Bill Travers, as had Born Free, the film,
Yeah.
which they're perhaps more famous for. But An Elephant Called Slowly was released in 1970, and after filming, and in spite of the protestations of the actors, Poli Poli, the elephant, a very young elephant who was born in the wild in Kenya, was gifted by the Kenyan government to London Zoo, where sadly she died in very poor circumstances alone in 1983. And it was that event really that
Hmm.
prompted Virginia and Bill to set up the charity, which was originally called ZooCheck, set up in 1984, the year after Poli Poli died. So this has been our 40th anniversary year.
Hmm.
And it was originally focused on highlighting the plight of wild animals in captivity in zoos and other captive environments, and all the associated welfare concerns around that issue. So yeah, we do work on the basis that we'd like to see a world where we don't hold animals in captivity for the purpose of human entertainment. And that's how we view zoos. Now I know that zoos, there are many hundreds, thousands of zoos across the world, and they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and all kinds of different things, and hold all kinds of different animals in all kinds of different conditions.
Hmm.
Zoos aren't a homogenous group.
Yeah.
But I think in recent times, the zoo industry, perhaps you'd call it the more responsible end of the zoo industry, the big zoo associations and so forth, have tried to, if you like, rebrand zoos as centres of conservation and education. But I think while some zoo associations and zoos themselves do conduct or contribute funds or resources or expertise to conservation programs, and very much accept that. And many zoos do operate what they claim to be educational programs, like school visits and talks and opportunities to learn about animals and so forth. We really question um, the validity of those claims and whether the conservation benefits or educational benefits that you might see from zoos outweighs the cost to the welfare and well-being of animals that are held in zoos. Many animals that are held in zoos that really don't lend themselves or adapt well to life in captivity. So there's the obvious species like elephants and polar bears and giraffes and big cats that clearly suffer. And I think the more we learn about animal behavior, the more we understand and realize how these animals suffer in captivity, and of course great apes and other primates, but many others suffer as well. I always remember seeing the wild dogs at London Zoo when I was doing my masters at the Institute of Zoology next door, and the repetitive pacing that that small group of wild dogs conducted in their tiny enclosure. When you think about the complexity of the environment that truly wild
Yeah.
African wild dogs live in, and the complexities of their social interactions with each other, within their packs, with other packs, with their wider environment. Those are things that are completely taken away from them in a captive environment. And those animals that I saw walking past that enclosure every day, circling round and round and round, you could see the tracks that they'd made in the enclosure, were clearly psychologically distressed by their experience.
It reminds me when I was a student, I went to Zimbabwe and we went doing some work. I always tried to combine EMS with a bit of traveling. And I remember getting up early and going into Wangi National Park and seeing a group of about 10 dogs trotting across the road, which was very, very memorable. And as you know, they're probably one of the most efficient killing machines, but track and hunt animals over huge distances, don't they? I think the problem, Mark, for me would be that we're losing biodiversity all the time. You know, the WWF report came out very recently. 73% of wild animals gone since 1970. To put that into perspective, you know, there were 4 animals in 1970. There's now only 1. And I always talk about, you know, sparrows in my lifetime. We've lost about 30 million sparrows in the UK. So the conservation work that we are doing in the UK and further afield, you know, in nature reserves, et cetera, is clearly also not working. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And we're now having these COP, you know, conferences. Obviously, we had COP29, which was on carbon. I know COP16's been going on. We've just had the plastics conference that has found no agreement on how we reduce plastic. You know, I see these as the 3 huge problems, and yet we end up having 3 separate meetings on them. Are we in danger of siloing all this? Because clearly, whatever we are doing, we are living in a more and more nature depleted world. I was at the Royal College's Fellowship Day last week, and the gentleman was from Rewilding Scotland. And I think of the 240 nations, Scotland, which, you know, many of us in Britain would see as a wild place, is, I think it was about 212th most, depleted biodiverse country in the world. And England and Wales, I think, were below rather than above. So for us, that, you know, that shifting baseline, we look at Scotland and we say wilderness, but clearly it isn't that. So within all of that, surely, you know, I look at like the Nini goose at WWT, you know, Peter Scott brought them back from extinction, has now taken them back to Hawaii. There has to be some places for that. Gerald Durrell did great work with the pink pigeon and the Mauritius kestrel. So we've got to get better at actually protecting our animals in the environments that they're from. And so far, I can't really give us an A star for that work, because over the last 50 years, we look as if we've been doing pretty poorly.
Yeah, I think that's all true. You mentioned the climate talks, obviously at COP29 recently in Abu Dhabi. The biodiversity talks under the Convention of Biological Diversity, which took place in Colombia in October, COP16, and the plastics treaty discussions that have just been happening. I'd add to that the efforts or attempts under the World Health Organization to create an international agreement on preventing, preparing for, and responding to pandemics. And
Yeah,
we should remember that the most emerging infectious diseases in people are zoonotic. In other words, they're derived from animals, and most of those originate in wildlife. But
yeah,
it's only when we disrupt and stress wild animals that we see these pathogens emerging and mutating and potentially spilling over and having the opportunity to move perhaps to other animal species and ultimately onto people. But all of those discussions are happening in isolation from each other. And although I think there is a gradually increasing recognition among many that all of these issues are interrelated and we can't solve one without addressing the others, nevertheless, we still speak to them, we still talk about them in silos. And the representatives, the really frustrating thing is, in many ways, that the representatives of governments who attend these meetings and who are there responsible for expressing their government's view on the issues and voting and so forth, are often from different departments of government, and often those departments don't really
yeah.
communicate or speak to each other very
Mm.
much. So we talk to the guys all the time in the UK and in other countries who work on animal welfare and biodiversity issues, but they don't necessarily know what's going on in Geneva at the talks aimed at preventing or preparing for future pandemics, or they don't necessarily know what's going on at the climate talks because it's a different people from a different department who attend those that they don't really speak to. So we need much more joined up thinking, and we need to realize that biodiversity is in crisis, partly because of climate change, but also mainly because of human exploitation, use of land, land use change, and so forth, and development. But biodiversity also offers us one of the biggest potential solutions to climate change, because if we protect biodiversity acts as an enormous carbon sink,
Mm.
preventing much of the release of
Mm.
global warming substances into the atmosphere, and protecting biodiversity and preventing our disruption of it, and dealing with things like wildlife trade and trafficking, where individual wild animals or groups of wild animals are put in situations which are completely alien to them and stresses them and brings them into close contact with other animals and people. Protecting biodiversity from those kinds of stresses and animals from those kinds of stresses is also key to preventing future pandemics.
Mm.
And I guess, with many vets being an audience to this podcast, they'll hopefully understand why, because it's when you stress animals that they tend to express pathogens, that pathogens get the opportunity as they're immune suppressed to
And as we cut down forests, we're, as you say, coming in closer
absolutely.
contact.
Yep.
And I think it's really interesting, the example there of, not only, because I think we have to accept that the climate crisis is upon us. And so
Mm,
things like mangroves obviously sequester carbon. They also, hold beautiful animals in them, so biodiversity will be increased. But then also they act as barriers against, sea rises and typhoons. I
absolutely.
know that climate-related disasters are up 83% in the last 20 years, according to UN figures. So we have to also mitigate against some of these things that we are seeing. I mean, I do a talk I've been around, on several veterinary events. Sometimes it's a month or two apart, and each time I start the presentation with some of the disasters that have just gone on, and then new disasters all the time, because we don't have to, if I said to you, talk to me about the disasters that are climate related in the last year, you don't just name one or two, you can probably reel off, 5 or 10, can't you? So this is becoming more of a problem. I do at the same time always feel that as a man of hope, we can turn this ship around. Do you see, and obviously, some of that will be looking, I think, at what is really nice and holistic are the UN SDGs, because they cover all of the areas. And, that thinking around mangroves is one of those examples. But do you think that vets are part of the climate crisis, or I like to call it an environmental crisis, because I think when we talk about climate, that means we just talk about carbon, whereas environmental, I think, covers plastic and biodiversity as well. Do you think that vets are part of the problem, or are they part of the solution to the environmental crisis?
It's a very interesting question. I think you have, if we talk about the veterinary professional, the veterinary industry, depending on how you look, rather than individual vets, because individual vets do all kinds of different things,
Hmm.
and many individual vets do the most wonderful work in all kinds of respects. When we're talking about their impacts on the lives of individual animals, or whether we're talking about the impacts of the lives of many animals through the conservation related work, or the animal welfare related work that vets do, and disease control and health planning and all that kind of thing. But I think so. I think vets have an enormously important part to play, but it's a part. We're trained in animal health and to an extent in animal welfare. I think at times there's a tendency to uh, over emphasize the role of vets in animal welfare at the expense of other um, people from other disciplines who have
Hmm.
a very important part to play when we're talking about our attitudes towards the welfare and well-being of animals, what we understand about animal sentience and so forth, and how we need to incorporate that into the way we treat animals, and ultimately into government policies about how animals are treated and protected through law and so forth. So you know um, anthropologists and philosophers and
Hmm.
behaviorists and so forth all have a huge part to play here, in addition to vets. I think vets tend to be the go-to place for the likes of governments and decision makers, because we're a relatively easy profession to identify, because we're a profession that requires a certain level of qualification, and that there are consequences if you get things wrong. So there are ways and means of regulating the veterinary profession, which is more difficult when you talk about the wider disciplines that have an important role to play. And I think because vets are primarily trained in animal health, and animal health is only one aspect of animal welfare, um, that tends to be somewhat limiting in some respects in um, the the broadness, if you like, of the advice and the work that vets can do in the context of these much bigger issues that we're talking about, these much bigger crises. We do have a role to play. Vets also play a very significant part in supporting livestock industries, but of
Hmm.
course livestock industries have also been implicated in the climate crisis, and there are all kinds of um, uh, issues around the role of livestock industries in the transmission of potentially zoonotic pathogens, which can also affect wildlife and potentially people as well. So I think if you try and step back, I think that there's a vet who's perhaps working in the livestock industry has his primary focus on supporting his farm clients, his or her farm clients. Um, but I think if you try and step back from that and look at perhaps the way we need to rethink at a global level the way that animal agriculture operates in order to reduce the negative impacts that it has on animal welfare, on potentially on health, and also
Mm.
on climate in particular.
If I can just
There's
interrupt just for a second, because we haven't really talked about it, but I think it's a lovely concept, and it's something I think I've certainly felt and done kind of naturally most of my veterinary life is that whole One Health concept,
mm,
which is very much if we're looking after environment, if we're looking after humans, if we're looking after the animals, we're probably going to be doing a much better job. And it was really interesting at the rewilding talk given on last Thursday at the Royal College Day, the Royal College Fellowship Day. Sometimes I think vets can act as bridges between parties. So farmers and environmentalists often historically have not got on well. But actually, now with some of the changes we're seeing in things like biodiversity net gain, Peter was talking a lot about rewilding, but I would then say, well, rewilding can go as a spectrum from regenerative agriculture, which could be agroforestry, which could also be, the biodiversity net gain so that we set aside some land, which is what we've done for generations, rather than pile it with inorganic phosphate and nitrogen and so on. And by having these areas semi-rewilded, they act as corridors for those nature reserves and those landscape type areas that we are starting to return back to a more natural perspective. Because obviously, we also have to grow food in its different forms for the population as well. And maybe that's an area that vets can give much more advice in with the environmental land management systems that have now been suggested by the governments and so on. So this is maybe one of the areas where I can see that vets can have a very natural place to start bringing those environmentalists and farmers together, that actually they share a lot in common. Quite often we have these disputes, and when you break it down, one of the advantages of the forum, the Green Forum, is just sitting down and listening to people. You suddenly realize that actually maybe these huge barriers aren't quite as huge as you thought they are. I don't know what you think of that, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some really good initiatives, agro-environment initiatives, as you say, that are coming forward all the time, looking at the way that we utilize land and how we can manage land better in order not only to improve food production, but also to enable nature to recover and
Yeah,
with all the benefits that gives. And I think vets have a role to play. They're not only vets, but I think, as you say, what we always benefit from, and I would say that those schemes there are some really good schemes available. They're not happening quickly enough. I think
yeah,
most of us would agree with that. When you look at what's happening with the climate, when you look at what's happening with biodiversity, these are crises that we're not dealing with quickly enough, either at a national level or at a global level. But there are some really good schemes out there, and vets clearly have the veterinary profession clearly has an important role to play in the development and the implementation of some of those schemes. But I think it needs to do that in collaboration and in discussion with people from other
yeah,
disciplines. So we shouldn't be relying on the veterinary profession to come up with all the answers, because our training at the end of the day is quite narrow. Or that's certainly the way I view it, having been through the training, back in the 1980s. And I do talk to veterinary students, master's students who've done veterinary undergraduate courses these days. And I think the way that the veterinary training at veterinary colleges is conducted these days is a little bit different from the way it was conducted in my day, as it were. I hope it is anyway, but it's still quite narrow, and
yeah,
it's there's so much to pack into it that it's
yeah,
actually quite difficult to find the space in the course and in the brains of the people who are trying to take in all this information that's being thrown at them, particularly with the complexity of modern medicinal and surgical techniques and so forth that people are being expected to take on board, which is increasing all the time. It's difficult to get some of these wider discussions into the curriculum. So people are coming out of veterinary college with perhaps less of a broad view than we'd like them to see, and many of them obviously create further opportunities for themselves to
Yes.
broaden their horizons, and that's great.
Well, this is
But
this is one of the things I talk about. When you go to vet school, you have to pass certain exams to become a vet, and the curriculum is set for you.
yeah,
Whereas we all, once we qualify, we set our own curriculum. I did dermatology. I've moved much more into this whole environmental area. I've spent the last 2 years studying a lot about economics to try and understand how we can make changes. And actually, some of the finance companies are well ahead of us. 100 million donated by Aviva, which is an insurance company, to people like WWT, because they realize that if they can mitigate against flooding using wetlands, which also improve biodiversity, they probably will have to pay less money out. It's always cheaper to prevent a disease than to wait till the disease strikes, like foot and mouth disease, and then have to do something about it. So it's, I think we have that degree, which is such a good base on which to then develop, as you've done, into the conservation and policy areas, and other people do other things. I want to finish, Mark, because I think as far as I'm aware, the way we met was I did a webinar with BVA, which was very much around the badger cull, and you quite rightly said, well, that was one position, which was the BVA's position, and we then did a webinar with you, which was very much more around the other side of the argument, which was that the cull should not happen. I would imagine that's 5, 6, 7 years ago now. You will be able to tell me better than I can. It's probably always longer than you think. So when did the cult start?
so the culls actually started, licensed culling actually started under the sort of government policy at the time in 2013.
Yeah, so
And
about 10 years. So
yeah, and since 2013, we've had around in 2013 they licensed 2 zones in Gloucestershire and Somerset as the kind of pilot cull zones. Since 2013, I think we've had culling. I'd need to check the figures. I haven't got them in front of me. In about 72 zones, covering about 3/4 of the land area of what's called the high risk area and parts of what's called the edge area. The high risk area in England.
yeah,
It's all in England. They don't cull in any substantive way in Wales. So the high risk area of England is largely in the west and
yeah,
southwest, but it covers a fair bit of the country. And a huge chunk of that has been or is now subject to badger culling. And according to government figures, since 2013, around 200 up until the end of 2023, we haven't had this year's figures yet. Around 230,000 badgers have been culled under license. That's nearly 250,000 badgers. That's an awful lot of animals. So I've always argued that I would argue that the evidence for badger culling being an effective way of reducing the spread of TB in cattle is at best equivocal.
yeah.
At worst, I just don't think it's there. I don't think it's credible. But at very best, it's equivocal.
We're 10 years in now, though,
Yeah.
Mark. So is TB going down in the cattle population, or is it staying the same, or is it going up?
By the measures that they used, TB it varies at a localized area, but countrywide in England and in Wales, TB has been slowly reducing from its peak of a few years ago in terms of both incidence rate and prevalence. But it's been reducing in a roughly similar way in the high risk areas of England than it has in the high risk areas in Wales. But in
Yeah,
Wales, they don't cull badgers. So it's not just about whether TB is reducing, it's about whether you can identify that badger culling has had a major influence on that reduction, because of course lots of other things are happening at the same time in terms of changes in testing intervals, in terms
Yes.
of biosecurity requirements, in terms of
Hygiene
trading and
is a huge
hygiene, and
thing, isn't it?
all of these things have also been introduced in areas over the
Yes.
past few years. So and it's now become very difficult to take any one of those factors out, badger culling being one of them, and say this has been responsible for this reduction in bovine TB, because it hasn't been designed as a big, you know, um, a big scientific trial,
Yeah.
and we don't have the controls to compare against. But when we very broadly look at what's happened in the areas that have been culled, and we try and compare that to areas in the high risk area of England that haven't been culled, and obviously the proportion of those areas has gone down and down as more and more areas have been licensed for culling. But we published a paper 2 or 3 years ago now in the Veterinary Record, which tried as best we could to compare data from areas that had been culled with areas that hadn't over the same periods of time.
Yeah.
And we couldn't find any difference in the pattern, the overall pattern of bovine TB in those areas. Obviously, you get differences in localized areas, but overall, we saw no significant difference at all that we could associate with badger culling. Now, obviously, other people have published papers which they claim do show a difference, but I think the evidence, some of that contradictory evidence, is at best equivocal. We've got a situation in Wales where bovine TB has also been reducing, presumably because of the measures that have been introduced, cattle-based measures that have been introduced over recent years, where they haven't culled badgers. So
Yeah.
I think at best it's uncertain, and in a case of uncertainty, to continue culling when you've already killed best part of 250,000 native animals at a time when our biodiversity is already in crisis seems irresponsible, certainly to me. And there are all kinds of animal welfare issues here as well,
Yeah.
around the methodology, the predominant methodology that's called controlled shooting, effectively shooting badgers.
I remember seeing a video of badgers being able to go into the cattle houses and eat the food, which obviously, if you can stop those sort of things, there's really important areas. Having said all of that, and I'll go back to the rewilding talk, and should we be introducing lynx into the country? And backward way of saying it, because I was speaking to another vet and who lives in Devon, is within the countryside, and said, whilst he perhaps sided with you on the whole point of is it effective from a TB perspective, what he was seeing was a lot more hedgehogs in the area. And we know hedgehogs are in crisis as well. Actually, urban hedgehogs probably doing better, the stuff that I see, than rural hedgehogs. I have 2 or 3 in my garden most days. I think they're now having a kip for a few months, so I probably won't be able to see them. But sometimes you can see the urban environment is actually more biodiverse. We're putting, more wildflowers in, etc. Whereas farms can be quite sterile monocultures of grass. Is there a view, with deer obviously reaching plague levels at some areas, are badgers at that level where they are disrupting hedgehogs because we don't have those apex predators anymore?
There's no doubt that badgers can predate on hedgehogs. They predate on ground nesting birds and eggs,
Yeah.
and so forth. But the evidence that I've seen from the likes of the um, um, uh, People's Trust for Endangered Species and the Hedgehog Preservation Society and others is that badgers are not a major cause of disruption for hedgehog. There are other factors that are affecting hedgehog populations, particularly in our rural environments. We know about the factors in the urban environments, and the same for ground nesting birds. Interestingly, I was just reading um, a piece on the People's Trust for Endangered Species website today, analysing some of the data and the British Trust for Ornithology's website, looking at data on ground nesting birds and an analysis of whether the culling of badgers has had a significant impact, and overall, it doesn't seem to have done so.
Right.
So, but again, that's not why badgers are being culled. Badgers
Yeah.
are being culled ostensibly to control TB in cattle. To politicise this a little bit, the incoming Labour government in its manifesto described badger culling as ineffective. If it's ineffective at controlling TB in cattle, there's no legal basis for issuing any more licenses, because that's the only legal basis on which the licenses have been issued. And to look at this in the sort of wider sense, there was a really interesting paper published, I think, back in about 2017 by Sarah Dubois and others, called International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control. And what it did, it set out a set of principles, a guideline, if you like, or a decision tree, if you like, a set of 7 principles a large group of ecologists and conservation scientists and ethicists and others had come together to put this paper together in order to guide decision makers when they're thinking about introducing some kind of wildlife management measure, whether it be culling or some other measure. The first thing that they ask you to think about is what's the problem here, and how do we solve the problem, and do we need to intervene with wildlife in order to solve the problem, or can we solve the problem by changing human behavior and our interaction with wildlife? And there are a whole bunch of other steps that they recommend, and we've been promoting this as what we think is a sensible and sound way forward for considering what action you might take when you perceive there to be an issue in which wildlife is involved and where some kind of wildlife management might be necessary. So what we're encouraging decision makers to do when they're looking at the badger cull, we're obviously 10, 11 years into badger culling now, or whether you're looking at any other form of wildlife management, whether it be some form of pest control or whatever, is to look at these principles and take them into account. And you might find that by thinking a little bit outside of the box, the solutions you come to are can solve some of the problems that you perceive without necessarily causing such havoc and devastation
Yeah.
for wildlife. So I think it's really important that we try and think a little bit differently about some of these issues.
Yeah. No, it's really good to get a quick sort of précis on where we're up to with that. So thank you so much, Mark. As always, podcast, I learn so much by speaking to erudite people like yourself, Mark. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast, and hope everyone who's been listening has enjoyed it as well. Just as before we finish, at the webinar vet, we're now going to be running the 4th Veterinary Green Discussion Forum. This is developing really we want to be at a point where, as a profession, we are halving our carbon. As an industry, we're halving our carbon. 30 by 30 is a concept that most governments and NGOs are working towards. That whole principle that 30% of our green space should be of high biodiversity value. And then, of course, I've just done a course on circular economy. We're actually becoming less circular rather than more because of our increased production of plastic. It's set to double in the next 20 years. So we've got some really big challenges, but I do agree with you that vets working in tandem with other professions like farmers, like conservationists, governments as well, because we are trusted, with governments, as you said. Hopefully we can continue to make a difference as you are doing in the great work you're doing with Born Free. And just thank you, and obviously Virginia and her son, for all the great work you're doing at Born Free.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for the opportunity. And just to plug Born Free, if anyone's interested in these issues, they can go to our website, which is www.bornfree.org.uk.
And we will, of course, put all of that information at the bottom of the podcast those of you who feel that you can contribute to Born Free's really important work, I know it's a great charity and well worth supporting as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's been great speaking to you as always, and hopefully not too long before we speak again.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening. Hope to see you on a podcast or a webinar, or who knows, even at the Veterinary Green Discussion Forum. Next year, we're taking it into Europe to the south of France. So if you're interested, get in touch, and hopefully see you there. It's a big problem, but humans are creative, and I think we can solve it. So hopefully we will see you at a podcast, a webinar, or at an event very soon. Take care and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.